Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this next session, which will be on digital policy issues, entitled The Role of Digital Technology in the EU's Slow Productivity Growth. We have a distinguished panel here today of 4 panelists. I'm Bertin Martens. I'm a research fellow at Bruegel, senior research fellow at Bruegel. To my left is Katinka Warsaw from the Danish Permanent Representation here in Brussels. And Katinka has been on the regulatory side for many years. She is also in the Danish Ministry of Digital Affairs. And she will, in the second half of next year, be one of the co-chairs of the telecommunication working group. Further to my left is Kai Zenner. I don't think Kai needs much of an introduction here in Brussels. He's an assistant to MEP Axel Voss in the European Parliament, and he has been working on digital regulation, which is almost his hobby, I would say, apart from his job. Most recently working on the AI Act and still working on that, I presume. On my right, I have Chris Ruff, who works for Digital Europe, the industry association. And so he is in this daily contact with companies in the digital transition. Prior to working for Digital Europe, he worked for the European Commission, for DG Trade, for Cecilia Malmström, whom we had here in the previous panel. And last but not least, we have Marleen de Koning from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Marleen is very active on AI issues, especially with regard to human resource management. She's written a book on that subject. And from her practice in PricewaterhouseCoopers, where she has daily interactions with clients who try to implement AI services, of course, she will be able to offer us a very good perspective. For people online and also for people in the audience, you can ask questions via Slido at #digitalpolicy. As you know, today Bruegel released our memorandums to the incoming commissioners, and we have also included a memorandum for the incoming digital commissioner. Let me just summarize our main messages from that memo before we go into question and answer session with the panelists. So our main point in the memorandum is that the EU is facing a growing productivity gap compared to the US. Our productivity growth is much slower than in the US, and that's a very worrying sign because that basically undermines in the longer term our relative, not only competitiveness, but also our economic welfare. And a lot of that is due to the fact that EU investment in digital services and digital industries is about 1/10 only of that investment in the US. Now, of course, the US has these huge digital platform companies, Microsoft, Google, Meta, Amazon, and so on. And they generate huge surpluses, which they can invest, of course, in digital technology. And we don't have these big tech platforms so much in the EU. So the question is, what can we do about this? Now, the memo recommends to the incoming digital commissioner that he or she should pursue 2 objectives. First and foremost, to try to increase digital investment in the EU in order to bridge that gap and that productivity gap, and also increase the uptake of digital services and technologies in the EU. And there's no doubt a role for the Financial Services Commissioner also in that regard, as we have mentioned also in several other panels today. Capital Markets Union and improved financial services is going to be an important part of that, to bring more private financing, private equity, private venture capital into the digital sector. But secondly, the EU Commissioner for Digital Affairs should also try to use what we call in general terms, leverage digital data as a true production factor in the economy, next to traditional production factors like capital and labor. Now, digital data is different from capital and labor in the sense that it's a non-rival production factor. Non-rival is economic jargon, but that basically means that data can be reused many times for many different purposes, apart from the use for which it was originally collected by the original data collectioner. And so bringing that reuse of data more into perspective, the Commission has been very active over the last couple of years. The previous Commission, if I may say so, has been very active in rolling out quite a number of digital regulations to promote data sharing and data reuse. There is the Digital Markets Act that contains a number of provisions for data sharing. There's the Data Act that goes very much into this. There's a Data Governance Act. And there are a number of sectoral regulations that have come out over the last couple of years, or that the Commission is still in the process of preparing. So in our memo, we advise very much to the next Commissioner that this should be pursued as a way of bridging that productivity gap. Now, on the other hand, there's a lot of complaints in the industry that these digital regulations trigger a lot of compliance costs, and that these compliance costs are holding back innovation to some extent, because what you invest in this compliance cost, maybe you cannot invest so much in more innovation. So also these digital regulations are a big step forward, the way they have been presented and agreed, but there's not enough. There are many not so pro-competitive provisions in these digital regulations, and maybe they are the start of a regulatory process, because things like the Digital Markets Act will take several years for implementation. The AI Act has only started, but there are a large number of implementation provisions and guidelines that still have to be decided. Similarly, on the Data Act, there are a lot of things still to be decided. So that leaves a lot of margin for the incoming Commissioner to see on how this margin for maneuver could be used to promote a more pro-competitive implementation and minimizing compliance costs for companies. There are many ways of doing that, and I hope in this debate that we can go a little bit deeper into that margin for maneuver and how this could be done. In the memo, we advanced the idea that, for example, the European health data space regulation that was approved a couple of months ago in the Council and Parliament could be a good template for creating industrial data pools. But on the other hand, we observe that the Commission is struggling in other sectors to create these data pools, and we get a very fragmented data regulation landscape. And that fragmentation in itself is a source of confusion and compliance cost, and there's need for harmonization, I think, in that approach. So let me go to our first panelist, to Katinka Worsel. Katinka is on the Danish permanent representation. Something that not many of you may know is that Denmark currently has the presidency of what is called the D9 Plus group of EU member states. That is a group, a subgroup in the Council, basically, of member states who are in the forefront of digital transition and trying to promote this digital transition as much as they can. And so maybe Katinka can say a few words on this D9 Plus groups. But I have basically two questions for her. The first question is that, in line with the memorandum, the Bruegel Memorandum, is that the EU prides itself in this Brussels effect. We see that many countries are trying to imitate the EU in regulation. The GDPR was very successful in that. We now see this also coming up with AI Act, where California is trying to move ahead, and some other countries as well. So you have been closely associated with all these digital regulations. So how do you see these digital regulations contributing to productivity growth in the EU, to accelerating our productivity growth, to bridging that gap with the EUS? And do you see room for, in the implementation modalities that still remain to be defined, to become more competitive and to implement them in a pro-competitive way to maximize innovation? So that's my first question. My second question to you is more about these data regulations in particular and data sharing modalities, and what I said before, that we get this very fragmented landscape of many digital regulations with different modalities, different governance regimes. Do you see scope for harmonization in that? Some people have advanced this proposal for creating this overall overarching digital regulatory authority in the EU that would bring all these together. Do you think this would be a good idea? So, if in a couple of minutes you could answer all these fundamental questions, I'll do a first round where each speaker has about 4 minutes, and then we'll go to the next.
I will try to answer these fundamental questions in 4 minutes, but first of all I will tell a bit about the D9 Plus that Bertin introduced. It's a very informal group. Originally, the 9 most digitalized countries in the EU, we grouped together, and we are basically a like-minded group in the Council. We try to align our positions a bit before and to push for certain agendas to be picked up by the Commission. We have been quite successful in pushing a risk-based approach to the AI Act during the last Danish presidency of this group. But it's really very informal, and it's not as such a structure under the Council, but it's a like-minded group. And we try to keep each other informed and help each other in Council meetings and in general towards the Commission. The next meeting will be in Copenhagen in September on the 26th and 27th, and we will have a stakeholder event on the 26th, where all of you are also very welcome. And one of the topics that we will be discussing is indeed competitiveness and resilience of a digital Europe. That's following up on the last discussions that we had in Dublin, where this was the main focus point. But then we will also have other debates on protection of children online and the wallet that Denmark is very interested in. And a sustainable digital transition. That was just a small teaser on what's happening on D9. As regards all the regulation that we have seen now in the last period, and I agree it is really a lot. I think everyone agrees. We have all been very busy. And that's also one of the things that we agreed in Dublin, that now we should focus on implementation and enforcement, and doing that in a coherent and effective manner. But before I say a bit more about that, I want to say that we fundamentally believe that responsible and trustworthy digitalization can be a competitive advantage for European companies. And we do see a demand for that globally. I think the Global Digital Compact that's being negotiated in these moments is a clear case in point, and we see all these other fora on AI especially. There is a demand for responsible and trustworthy digitalization. And Denmark is a very digitalized country, and we have only been able to do that because our citizens trust the digitalization that we more or less say, impose on them to some extent in the public sector, but also from the private side. So we really think we support that we regulate in the EU. We believe in the Brussels effect, but we shouldn't overdo it, and we shouldn't make it too complicated for the companies to live up to. And that's where the enforcement and implementation and all the implementing acts that we are working on now, and delegated acts and guidelines that the Commission will be doing. I think we all think now we're done with the AI Act and that's it, but there's so much more coming under all the laws. And we remain vigilant that this is balanced, so we do not impose even more regulatory burden in the details. And as you all know, the devil is sometimes in the details. So there's really a lot of work still going on with our experts. And we do everything we can in the D9 group to keep that not too burdensome. But even if we do that very well, we think that it's difficult for the different companies, especially for small companies, to live up to everything. So what we have done in Denmark just last week, our ministry was actually made bigger. So we have all digital files within our ministry, and also our agency is conducting a mapping of all digital EU files to reach out to all the other authorities that are involved in digital regulation. Digital regulation is a bit difficult to define, but something that will impact companies coming out of the digital single market idea. And the idea is not that we should take over any responsibility for enforcing that, but at least we should coordinate and give the companies one portal where they can report, and one portal where they can go and get guidance on everything. This is a bit of a vision, right? It's not going to happen within the last couple of months, but at least we are trying to coordinate across authorities, across different acts, to make it as easy as possible for companies, and to make it possible to report and everything else what the companies have to do digitally. So that's something we are, of course, also recommending the Commission to do. We have now a lot of boards in all the different acts, which is good. It's a step forward to before, where we didn't coordinate between the member states. Now at least we have the boards. Even in the AI Act, we have the AI Office. So we also think it's necessary that the boards coordinate to some extent, and also with the Commission and other authorities enforcing digital acts. So we have had some discussions with the Commission on this, but again, where's the silver bullet? I'm very happy to discuss it with the colleagues here. I think it's something that will be discussed in Brussels for some time still. And another thing I think we need to reflect more on is, when does it make sense for the EU to enforce? In the AI Act, we had this differentiated approach. We also have it in the DSA. Both of those came a bit in the trilogues. I'm not saying it's random where the line is, but I think we should think about it more structured and horizontally. For which companies or for which areas, which cases do we think that the EU should enforce? Yeah, I'm fine. I'm done now. So that's two things we think could help on making the regulation easier for companies.
Okay, thank you very much, Katinka. So we heard the regulator side. I'm now turning to the industry side, to Chris Ruff. Chris, this widening productivity gap and competitive gap is also a concern, I presume, for your industry members of Digital Europe. So how can we bridge that gap? So same question for you. And then, first of all, to what extent do you think these digital regulations that the regulator came up with, or is industry overwhelmed by this? To what extent? Or can they cope with this? How do you see this? How could it be used for industry, trusted and secure environment as something that advances their competitiveness in the market? And then secondly, how do we bridge that investment gap? We don't have these magnificent 7 big US-based digital platforms in the EU. But the question is, does it matter? Do we need to? Can we live with smaller platforms, with smaller digital service providers, and can that increase our competitiveness? Is that enough? Or should we try to go still for these big companies, and how would we do that? We have the Digital Markets Act, but even if at the end of the day that would be fully implemented and all companies would be fully compliant with all these obligations, will that bring more investment to the EU?
Thank you, Bertine, and thank you for having us. Thank you for having Digital Europe here. For those of you that don't know us, we represent everybody in the digital ecosystem, from the very largest companies to the very small, something like 45,000. So we really have that overview. And you may not know, but we turned 25 this year. Digital Europe was founded in 1999 as EICTA. And I thank my predecessor every day that he changed the name to Digital Europe, because EICTA is a bit of a mouthful. And 1999 was a very different place for digital. in Europe, right? We had European companies dominating in terms of handsets, in terms of mobile phones. We recently changed office, and I went into our archives as we changed, and we had the AICTA tech brief that we used to print out and put into every MEP's cubbyhole. There might be associations that still do that, but at Digital Europe we don't. And in there, it was interesting to read what the big issues of 1999 were. One of them, chapter 1, this is September 2000, over-regulation of the digital sector. And I might come back to that in a moment. But one thing that wasn't there was investment. Investment, because, as I said, the digital world has changed. These days, what our companies need, and what from the very small to the very big, is speed and scale, right? They need to grow and grow quickly, or else you're going to get eaten by somebody else, okay? And that requires huge amounts of investment. And that's exactly what we don't have in Europe today. Investment on the private side, of course. This is something we need to stimulate, and we at Digital Europe, we're not, in 1999 we were talking to DG Connect or whatever it was called back then. Now we're talking to almost every DG because digital is so cross-cutting. So we take an active interest in the Capital Markets Union because it's of vital importance for this digital productivity gap, as you put it. We take an interest in all kinds of other sectors as well. So Capital Markets Union, how can we stimulate all this money that's sitting in savings accounts in Europe? The fact is that only 6% of VC funding to AI startups last year went to EU companies. So there's a huge issue there that we can start to solve with the Capital Markets Union. The second one is public funding. Of course, a lot of money in public funding. At the EU level, we had an experiment after COVID where we said 20% of the RRF should go to digital. And it's an experiment that worked. You know, people said, how are you going to do this? But, you know, the countries are spending the money in all kinds of things. So why not say, given that digital is this cross-cutting thing across all sectors now, that the next EU budget should have 25% across the whole budget? And yes, I'm talking about agriculture, defense, all these areas have huge potential to be digitalized, and this is a way we can stimulate this with public funds from the EU level. But of course, the EU budget won't be enough, so you need to combine the two, and member states need to play a role as well. So you talk about the productivity gap. We recently published a piece called The Critical Tech Gap in June, and what we did, we took 8 of the 10 critical technologies that the Commission has identified in its economic security strategy, and we looked at them across the whole value chain and said, where does Europe sit? Where are European companies and their partners sit in this value chain? And the headline is that in 7 of the 8 critical technologies, Europe is behind. We're ahead in one, which is advanced connectivity. You know, Nokia and Ericsson, they don't make the phones anymore, but they're still ahead when it comes to 5G and this. So we're ahead here, but we risk losing that position as well if we're not careful, because we create the technology, we're excellent in R&D, but 5G deployment across Europe is terrible, you know, compared to other regions. So, you know, we're still ahead there. Then there's a whole bunch of technologies, energy technologies, space tech, and others, where we're kind of there or thereabouts, I would say. You know, particularly in energy tech, we led in solar and wind and others, and we still have a strong position, but we're losing it, okay, for various reasons, and I'll come back to more of them in a moment. But and then the two where we're way behind, one is artificial intelligence, and the other one is advanced semiconductors. Now, we've had the EU Chips Act, tried to address some of those issues, and now we've had the AI Act. I'm not sure the AI Act is going to address that issue, though, frankly. And you'll tell me that's not what it was there to address, but of course, we have the AI Act in place. Now we ask, so you know, whatever you think about the AI Act, and I think, you know, in the end, Digital Europe had some issues, but it was a decent piece of legislation, and great work by everyone involved. But it will add an extra burden to companies operating in Europe, whether you like it or not. Okay, that's just a fact. So what can we offer to those companies by way of, you know, all the other stuff I mentioned? So investment and I'll come back to maybe in later questions about the question of regulation. You mentioned it, Katinka, all these different regulations that are coming into place at the same time, as well as the single market. So the single market is such a big issue, I think we'll come back to it later, but if I go back to the beginning, I said tech companies need speed and scale, and the fact is, it's very difficult to scale across borders in Europe as a company. Okay, maybe we'll come back to that in a moment.
Okay, so we heard from the industry side, there's a much longer shopping list on that side. Let me turn to the other regulator here, the Parliament, to Kai. Kai, you have been very instrumental in the AI Act, particularly in Article 52, that deals with generative AI models. That was not originally foreseen in the Commission's proposal because the technology was entirely new. So AI is sort of the domain par excellence where the US innovates and the EU regulates. So don't you fear that we have been over-regulating this a bit? That the AI Act, as Chris said, may impose high compliance costs on model developers and also on hundreds of thousands of companies that want to deploy AI in their company, in their services with their customers. And related to that is, again, this investment gap. We don't have these big companies that have pockets full of money to invest in infrastructure. And so EU companies, we've seen over the last year that EU AI startups are signing agreements with these big EU companies to collaborate with them, get access to their infrastructure, to train their models, to run their models in a daily use. And is that a good or bad thing? Should we build our own European infrastructure? Over the last couple of months, there's a lot of talk in the Brussels bubble about creating the Commission investing in creating its own European big AI infrastructure. Is that a good idea in your view? We can create the infrastructure, the physical hardware, but if we don't have links to business models that make it viable, economically viable, how is that going to work? Up to you, Kai.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. I will try to keep it short in order to not speak too long, because your questions were extremely broad and I could say a lot of things. But maybe to complement also what the other two co-panelists said already. I think Renate Nicolai said it now several times, deputy from DG Connect, that we saw a first generation of digital laws. Now we have a second generation of digital laws, which I like very much, and I do see a big difference, and I think especially with the second generation of AI, we are addressing a lot of problems, even some of the problems that we are still identifying as hampering innovation, hampering our economy, and so on. So there is definitely a big improvement, and probably maybe in 5 to 6 or 8 years, I believe that we have a good chance to really improve as a situation for startups, for SMEs that want to invest in AI, deploy AI, and so on. My big fear is the time until there, because what we heard already, many of the laws that are in the second generation of EU digital laws are not really concrete. The AI Act is extremely vague. You know that this is one part of my main criticism and so on. And indeed, a lot of secondary legislation is needed, codes of practices, codes of conduct, and so on. And right now, there are a lot of problems that indeed, in our view, so Axel and my view, lead at the moment to much more over-regulation than helpful regulation. If I try to single out 3 points, Scott, my colleague, is sitting here. Scott and I, the first point that I want to make, are working on this big overview of digital laws. If we manage to find everything, we say that there are now 116 digital laws. There are 18 digital governance mechanisms. All of them, it's completely unclear how they are standing to each other. There are hundreds of overlaps, hundreds of contradictions, and for companies, it's actually impossible right now to become compliant. A German company told me it's rather leading in the digital field that 30% of their staff is right now looking into compliance. They cannot invest their time into promoting innovation, developing new products, and so on. And all of that is what we are saying, going back to a big problem with better regulation, that the better regulation agenda that we have here in place with all their safeguards and so on is constantly overlooked. There is a huge lack of coordination between co-legislators, but also within the EU institutions and so on. Digital Europe made a very good point that we also in the Parliament made a few years ago, that actually there are wrong KPIs for policymakers. Actually, we are benefiting if we are creating laws as soon as possible, and quality is not so important. So what we need to do in order to solve this first point that I'm making is probably really a strong interinstitutional reform, maybe even treaty changes, because we just did too much and too uncoordinated. The second point that I want to make, and I see it also quite strongly in the Bruegel work of the last months, and also Digital Europe and many others were making this point. Again, the first and the second generation of digital laws are tackling a lot of problems, a lot of important points, and so on. There are actually even really good programs like the Digital Decade program and so on. The problem is that there is something missing. There is missing a common layer, an overarching layer. So a lot of good ideas similar to the laws, but what does it mean? You were speaking about AI. What does it mean that we as Europe want to create a third way on AI? No one knows. I work now for 7 years on AI policy. I don't know it. I cannot answer to this question. The same is also happening in the digital field. We want to do a European way to digital, but no one really knows it. Again, we have a lot of unconnected ideas, but what we really need to do is, and this is now going to the competitiveness point, we need to make sure this is what we want to achieve by European digitalization. Those are maybe niches where we are still having good chances to compete, maybe even are still much better than our non-European competitors, and this probably by further also advancing the green and digital transition, because there our companies did quite a lot over the last months. So such a unified narrative with clear policy goals, with clear KPIs, and also with technical standards could probably help our companies to know a little bit better how also to deal with all those 116 laws, with all those pressures, and help them to focus their attention in areas where it really makes sense economically. I know I'm already quite lengthy. A third point, just very short, that is always one of the major points of my boss, Axel Voss. He thinks that especially member states now really need to step up. They are actually blocking a lot of stuff that the Commission is proposing. One example is the AI lighthouse, where again member states couldn't agree where this lighthouse is in the end located, and then in the end nothing happens and everyone loses. We have also the investment problem. We have also obstacles like on the digital single market, the CMU, digital skills, and so on, that Chris and I talk now for 10, 15 years here in Brussels, but there is not really some advance. So there we definitely need heavy investments. We probably, going back to the treaty changes, need also further transfers of national competence to the European level. And I think it was at least in one of the position papers, we fully agree that there should be more infringement proceedings against member states if they are not implementing, which again leads to forum shopping. And since I'm talking already quite long, very shortly to your model question, but very shortly. Indeed, there are at the moment, in our opinion, two tracks basically for, now to your example, for AI startups. First track is the Mistral AI or also Silo AI case. Silo AI was bought by AMD because if you really want to scale up and create a horizontal, powerful, globally leading AI model, you cannot do it alone. I mentioned some of the problems and others were mentioned already. The second option is going back a little bit to my previous point, is Aleph Alpha, which realized, okay, our model is not comparable in quality terms with OpenAI and so on. So what we are doing is now, I talked about it, we are really concentrating in niches that those big models from OpenAI are not really addressing. So B2G, G2C, and so on and so on. And this combined with this large narratives that I was talking about, I think those two things are at the moment the best way forward until we are really tackling the bigger points. Maybe I stop here and the rest we can do later.
Thank you for this very extensive reply to my two, I thought, simple questions, but they are clearly much more complicated. Let me turn to Marleen de Koning. She works for PricewaterhouseCoopers. And Marleen, you are in daily interaction with your clients at PricewaterhouseCoopers, clients who are trying to implement AI-based services, either internally in the organization or in their interactions with their own customers. So, again, two questions for you. So, what can you tell us about what impact AI has on your clients in terms of productivity growth or more efficiency, of profit growth? Is it really worth it for these clients to invest a lot of money in creating the model, training a model, adapting it to their specific circumstances? And also, to what extent is PricewaterhouseCoopers involved in helping clients being compliant with the regulation? And I read somewhere that in the consultancy market, compliance with AI regulation and data regulation is one of the fastest growing market segments. So for consultancy companies, it's very beneficial, but can your clients afford the cost of doing these things? How do you experience that in your daily practice?
So many questions, so let me break it down a little bit. And for those who don't know me, I work at PwC, where I lead a team, and we help our clients with implementing emerging technology. So of that also AI and Gen AI more recently. But we also do a lot of research into what's going on in the market. So currently I'm also leading a research in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. And we also look at not only at the automation, but also at the augmentation part in relation to productivity and Gen AI. And so not AI in general, but really on Gen AI. And that also brings some interesting things to table in regards to productivity, because we've been automating for a while, and organizations has been investing a lot in the automation part, but now with augmentation part, there's also a belief that that it will gain more productivity and potentially new business models for organizations if they invest in this type of technologies. And if you look at some of our researchers, so we conduct the research among CEOs across the globe, so around 5,000 CEOs. And 40% of the European business leaders, in that sense, they don't think their company will survive in the next 10 years. And part of that is also that that technology is the heart of that change. So they're really looking into how technology can enable them in changing the way that they've been working. And that's an effect that I'm seeing also on a daily basis with organizations. And there's a difference between industry, and there's also a difference between sophistication of organizations in how far they are on their AI journey. So especially if we think about generative AI, part of the organizations are still in an experimental phase. And they're looking and assessing into what is the ROI that I will get out of the investment that I'm making, where should I experiment, how can I gain this productivity. But there are also organizations that already started in 2019 when the first GPT models were there, even before it hit the democratization and the big markets with the 3.5 model, and that have been experimenting slowly and building their own models on this and using their data and having their data governance in order and their data structures in order. And part of a big part of the governance and everything is also in the data and the data structures. And if companies want to start now and they don't have their data structures in order and not their data governance in order, there's a bigger risk for those organizations. So then all of a sudden the investment comes now as well in making sure that they prevent leakage, that they prevent oversharing and all of the other things that already were cybersecurity risks. Prior to Gen AI, but Gen AI potentially accelerates these risks, so therefore also accelerates the investments in making sure that these type of things are really in order. And I think if you think about going from experimentation to skill, what many of my clients are looking into are three things mainly. And one is around the quality of the models that they're using and the quality of the AI. And then they look at reliability, applicability, usability, and all these things, and that the AI needs to be good enough. Why? Because the people in the organization needs to trust the outcome and that it helps them with the work that they're doing. And if the trust is not high enough for the organization, then it won't deliver its value, and then it will not deliver the productivity gain the organization is seeking, because people are not using it, or clients of my clients are not using it. And then the third one is also around the adoption, so making sure that the people in the organization have actually the skills to use the AI in the right way in order to be able to reach that productivity gain. And then if you think about one of the things in that regards to the trust and adoption is also the fear of making mistakes. So that organizations really want to prevent reputational damage or prevent being known for making mistakes. So that is also a reason why they sometimes tread lightly, next to making sure that the governance is there, is also to make sure that they are winning in their industry and being a leading company, but not going as fast that those mistakes are made. And that's why many of those organizations really follow a responsible AI framework, either that's developed by a consultancy firm like ours or that's been set in market standards, because they don't want to make those mistakes. And I think one of the recent researches that we as PwC also launched together with Demos is about the trustworthiness of the systems that you're using, and that it's not only about the trust, but really the trustworthiness that people have in the systems that are using. And we not only talk about having the human in the loop, where they validate what the AI has been doing, but really looking, if you break down the tasks that people have, making sure that we bring the AI in the loop. So breaking down those tasks and then having the human being in the lead, but then having more the AI as the assistant that helps in automating those tasks and augmenting those tasks. So really making sure from a governance perspective that's really that it's not only the validation that potentially has a potential for automation as well, but that you really go into the more of the the human working together with the AI in that sense. And then regarding to governance and to the cost that you're saying, I think there is some investment in that sense, but many organizations, what I said, already have been investing in the data security part of it, and the trustworthiness is really important for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we should open up now the floor for question and answer from the audience. Mr. Liikanen. Wait, microphone, please.
Actually, this week, a book was published by name European Digital Policies during the last 40 years by Detlef Eckert. It goes from those years to today. When you talk about 1999, It's a long ago, I'm an old man, of course, but I mean, and that autumn, not only ECTA was established, but also proposal for local loop unbundling was made. The rapporteur was Nick Clegg, British MEP. 2017, Thomas Philippon, professor at New York University, made a book by name The Great Reversal. So that was a big victory for Europe over American overregulation. Were they wrong at the time? Did the market become too competitive? That's my provocative question.
Okay, is that a question? Who wants to go into this? Well, let us take a few questions. Yes, please, over there.
It was not discussed today, but the question of separation of data from platforms. There is very promising Web3 data space technologies that do that. And I think maybe this could be a solution for many issues, like including, for example, the need to compete with big dominant platforms because they wouldn't own the data anymore. This would open space for many other innovative companies, and this has many other spillovers. So can someone comment if this is considered as a policy for European Union? Thanks.
More questions? Yeah, okay, let's start with those. Panelists, anyone wants to venture on this one?
I can shortly answer on that. So, as you have seen, von der Leyen proposed this data union that no one completely knows what is behind it. It's one of the few moments where my boss and I have a slightly different opinion. He is known for pushing for a GDPR reform, and he would really like to use this proposal by von der Leyen also now to reopen everything and so on. I'm allowed to say my own opinion. I think right now all of those ideas, also the idea that you mentioned, are good. They should be collected. More research should be done on that. But right now, I really hesitate to do anything else. If it's not clearly identified as a major problem right now, because there are just so many new data laws, also Data Governance Act, Data Act. E-privacy is completely unclear if we are now getting a new proposal or if we need to work with the old one. Then AI Act, DSA have also a lot of references and will lead to some open questions. And I think it would be wise to focus, as my colleague said, first now on secondary legislation, clarify where are the problems, where are the gaps, and then maybe at the end of the term do something legislatively. But right now, at least from our group, EPP, except Axel and a few others, and also many other groups in the parliament, there is a little bit of hesitation actually to regulate more.
Yeah. Chris, maybe you want to go into that historical question.
I'm a little bit young, I must admit. In 1999, I was a 10-year-old boy dreaming, a British boy dreaming of a long career as an EU official. And that was that, you know what happened to that. So Nick Clegg was that. But I think what you're getting at is that back then it was America that was seen as the over-regulator. Is that what you said? So,
because telecom operators say now that profits are too much down. At the time, that opened the broadband in Europe. So Europe, the access to broadband was higher than in America. It was considered to be a big success. My question, are the operators now right and those people then wrong?
Okay.
I'm not sure. I'd prefer to answer the data question if that's okay. Not because it's not a good question. I just don't have a good answer for you. This is too sensitive for
your membership.
Just don't have a good answer for you.
Okay.
No. I think to follow up from Kai, I mean, we had the Data Act, right? I mean, that was partly the rationale behind it was to open up the data of companies. But it got to a point very late in the process, and we're talking in the trilogues phase, where in Digital Europe, a lot of our European members, big manufacturing companies, car makers, all these digitalizing sectors where they woke up to the fact that actually this is going to take away data from them, and they'll be forced to give up their data to competitors, whether they be in Europe, the US, or elsewhere. So sometimes, you can start a piece of legislation with one idea, and then there are effects that you don't have in mind. And we managed to close some of those loopholes in the end, but it's a warning, I think, for that kind of, and yes, I think we've had enough regulation on data in the past Commission. So we saw a lot of great stuff in von der Leyen's her opening speech and what she planned for her new term, but it was a little alarming to see yet more plans for data regulation on top of what we've already got. Bearing in mind, as you said, Katinka, we haven't even started implementing the last lot yet. So.
In terms of implementing and thinking about it from an organizational perspective, even global companies, they oftentimes follow the EU legislation if it's the most strict, because if you want to roll something out globally or build something globally, it's oftentimes harder to say, no, we're going to exclude these countries, or we're not going to offer it to clients in these countries. There are some global organizations who choose to do so. They offer different offerings in different countries or these type of things because of the legislation. But otherwise, you see that many take these acts into account when building things or when rolling out things. So, yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure there are many other telecom people in the room who would like to go into this debate. I think that there's a basic difference between telecom and digital platforms that we see today, in the sense that telecom was physical infrastructure, was not a data-driven thing, while these platforms are data-driven. And data are non-rival, while physical infrastructure is rival. So I'm not convinced that telecom regulation is fully applicable in these digital platforms. But let me come back also, Chris, and go a few steps even before you were born. We haven't really spoken about the single market and the digital single market. And everybody in this town is eagerly waiting for Mario Draghi's report on the single market coming out in the next couple of days. And we've seen Mr. Letta's report a couple of months ago. And I wonder, and I hear rumors that people are trying to revive this concept of a digital single market that the last Commission has really sort of put somewhat in a secondary position. So my question really to close this debate is, do you see any prospect in the single market giving us a great leap forward in productivity growth? Or is this a slow grinding affair, as we say in our memo, that needs to be continued, but that will not give us a certain quick push upwards? So maybe Katinka, last word for you, since you're going to co-chair the telecom committee on this.
Yeah, maybe that's a good thing to look into. I mean, from a Danish perspective, we really think the digital single market is the core of what we are doing. Well, both regulatory, but also to support the economy in Europe. So regulatory-wise, I think we have all said it now. Maybe we shouldn't have too much new regulation. The e-privacy may be one case in point where something needs to be done. But otherwise, let's focus on implementation, also in regards to data. I agree with what has been said. We are also eagerly awaiting what a data union could be. But we think it's better to implement what we have and let it work, and maybe have guidelines, across instead. But digital single market really for us is the main focus point. I brought a few numbers because I know that you like numbers in Bruegel. So just to come back also to your point on investments in digital, I think we all agree we lack investments in digitalization, and we can regulate as much as we want. If we don't invest, it won't help. As part of the Recovery and Resilience Fund, so exactly those money that you explained, we created a program in Denmark called SME Digital, with very easy funds to SMEs who wants to digitalize. So really the low-hanging fruits, not inventing new AI models, just setting up a new website, buying a customer management system. And we can see from the companies who actually received that funding that 65% of those have an increase in their productivity or expect an increase in their productivity after 1 year. That's really fast. And when they received the funding 1 year before, only 48% thought that they would benefit from it on productivity. So it's actually much more effective than the companies believe themselves. So I think this easy access to money as fast as possible. Well, Denmark is of course still in the Bruegel 4, but when you have a Digital Europe program or the new competitive fund, you need to meet the companies where they are and make it easy for them, and then to have the digital single market, because that's scale. If you can't, I mean, if you're just in Denmark, you will not be able to compete with the big American companies. We need a digital European market, and we need a capital markets union.
Chris, one last word for you.
Yeah,
How can we prevent that your grandchildren will still look at the same problem 50 years down the road?
Well, some of you might know my boss is Danish, and I think we agree with the Danes, and we're looking forward to their presidency when it comes to the digital single market, but Denmark is still a member state, and there are some taboos which I think need to be broken. Let's face it, all member states have to tackle this, because when we have the AI Act, for example, why do we insist on having 27 AI offices? And this goes back to the point I made before. For a small company trying to launch a product or grow in Europe, the more offices you have to knock on the door, and it's not just AI office, it's a data office, the DPAs, there's countless new institutions being created, partly because member states want to have their piece of the pie or have some control, right? And this is a taboo that I think we need to break. Von der Leyen has been a president to break taboos when it comes to common European debt and others, but let's make the next 5 years a taboo-breaking 5 years, so that my grandchildren can enjoy.
Marleen, one last word for you. What would you advise to EU policymakers to do to make it easier for your client companies to implement all these digital services, and in particular the AI-driven services?
Yeah, I think there are a few things you can do, but I think being consistent and being clear on what is expected on the regulations, and also helping organizations and enable them that they can plan years ahead. I mean, if you think about the majority of the organizations, and if they think about their viability and their growth, they make plans years ahead. So if there's a lot of uncertainty in what is coming in policies, and if there's a lot of uncertainty on how to handle or how to be able to regulate those, that doesn't help them to increase their speed of innovation, and it doesn't help them to increase their productivity. So that clarity can really enable them. And then, I mean, many organizations already see an uptake in the use of technology. We see from our research the incentive also for different type of jobs, that there's even a wage incentive if you now can work with technology. So companies are really attracting people to work more and more with AI and work more with these technology. But then if there's a lot of uncertainty of what is expected or how the regulation will continue, that could potentially hinder that innovation. So, yeah.
Okay, with this we have come to the end of our panel. Thank you very much to the panelists for contributing to this debate, and thank you to the audience for being present.